Welcome back to A Localized Journey, the series where we take a long, hard look at the localization of various games across time. The first game we've been looking at is the iconic Pokemon Red version, and if you remember Part 1, you'll know this game definitely has its fair share of localizations. And the same can be said for what we're going to be looking at here today in Part 2. However, before we get started, I'd like to just clarify a few things. I mentioned this in the pinned comment of Part 1, but just in case some people didn't check that, I figured I'd reiterate it here as well. That is that the Pokemon descriptions in the English version of this game are those taken from the Japanese Blue version. I talked about them in Part 1 as if they'd been localized from the original Red version, but that was incorrect, and I apologize for any misinformation that caused. I didn't plan on talking about Pokemon descriptions going forward anyway, because they're all pretty similar in how they're localized, so this shouldn't really be an issue. I also confirmed to the best of my ability that everything else, including the dialogue and names, are the same across Japanese versions, so we should be fine in comparing the Japanese Red to the English Red for the rest of the series. But anyway, without further ado, let's get on with Part 2 of a localized journey through Pokemon Red. Picking up where we left off last time, we just finished our battle with the Shorts Kid on Route 3, and are currently making our way towards Mount Moon. The first trainer we run into after the kid who's obsessed with shorts is a bug catcher. This bug catcher happens to have a Metapod, or Toranseru in Japanese. The name Toranseru comes from the Japanese pronunciation of the word transform, or Toransuformu, as well as shell, or sheru, and cell, or seru. Following this battle with the bug catcher, we run into yet another lass, who in Japanese states that she's interested in the angle of our gaze, implying that we were looking at her miniskirt or something like that. But in English, her dialogue was localized to be that she's simply intrigued by the look we gave her. The original Japanese clearly had some sexual undertones, which were understandably removed. When this lass is defeated in battle, she says, "Can't you be gentle with girls?" in Japanese, but commands you to be nice in English. I'm not really sure why this was changed, because the original was fine and provides the player with more detail, but it's obviously not a huge change. A little ways down the route we run into one final lass, but this time it's not her dialogue that was changed. Her Pokemon Jigglypuff knows the move Pound, which was localized from the Japanese move known as Hataku. Hataku in Japanese has several meanings, but the one that applies here is to hit something with a flat object like the palm of your hand. In this case, it's close to a slap in English. Pound implies that you're using your fist to either punch or smash something, but that doesn't really line up with the original intention for the move in my opinion. But anyway, once we make it past all the trainers on Route 3, we arrive at the Pokemon Center situated just outside Mount Moon. Inside we run into a trainer who informs us that we can carry up to 6 Pokemon at one time, but his dialogue has been slightly altered in the English version of the game. In Japanese, he counts out all 6 of his Pokemon as he puts them on his belt, but in the English he just says he has 6 Pokemon. Also in this Pokemon Center is the old guy who sells you a Magikarp, and he's noticeably more upbeat and expressive in the original Japanese. Magikarp is known as Koi Kingu in Japanese, which obviously comes from the koi fish and the Japanese pronunciation of king, which is Kingu. And now that our business in the Pokemon Center is concluded, we finally head into Mount Moon. Since this is a cave in a Pokemon game, that means we're going to be fighting a lot of Pokemon, and the one we run into the most here is none other than Zubat. The weird thing about Zubat is that its name wasn't changed at all from the original Japanese. In Japanese, Zubat is known as Zubato, which comes from the Japanese pronunciation of bat, as well as the word Zubato, which, among other things, means to do something quickly and without hesitation. You'd think that with a name like this, it'd be changed, but that wasn't the case, and I've got to give props to the localizer for that one. After a little exploring and battling, it comes time for my Squirtle to evolve. Now in Japanese, when a Pokemon starts to evolve, it is said that it's acting strange, while in English we all know it just simply says the Pokemon is evolving. This is another case of oversimplification that only serves to sterilize the experience, in my opinion. So many things so far in this game have been simplified down to very basic language and concepts, presumably for the benefit of the children playing the game. The problem with that, though, is that the original game was also meant for kids, so why was so much of it changed if the original creators thought what they were making would work with a younger audience? Add that to the list of questions we'll probably never know the answer to when it comes to Pokemon localization. Getting back on track here, our Squirtle evolves into Wartortle, who is known as Kameru in Japanese. Like is the case with many other Pokemon, there are a lot of possible origins for this name. The obvious here is Kame, meaning turtle, but there's also Kameru, which means to be able to bite, as well as male, as in male armor, and mare, the French word for sea. There's also the Japanese pronunciation of the English word tail, or teiru, which would make sense seeing as Wartortle has a giant tail. Following the evolution, we progress a ways into Mount Moon and come across a rare candy. In Japanese, rare candies are known as fushigi na ame, which literally means mysterious candy. The connotations here are quite different from the localized game, as the English implies the candies are hard to find or few in number, while the Japanese implies they're just strange or mysterious in how they work. Honestly, this is kind of a weird change to make in my opinion, because the original was absolutely fine, so the meaning was changed for, as far as I can tell, no good reason. Moving northwest from the rare candy, we run into a certain lass, among whose Pokemon is the first Oddish we encounter. Oddish's Japanese name is Nazo no Kusa, which literally means mysterious grass. And seeing as I wasn't prepared to face a grass-type Pokemon this early in the game, I actually run out of usable Pokemon and have to start back from the beginning of the cave. On my second run through, the first trainer I find is a Rikake no Otoko, or Science Man. Typically when used to refer to a person, Rikake means that that person is on the geekier side and probably happens to enjoy some science. This name was localized in English as Super Nerd, which is honestly just a bit offensive if you ask me. This Super Nerd starts out the battle with a Magnemite, or Koiru in Japanese. The original name comes from the English word coil, which refers to an electrical coil, sometimes used to make magnetic fields. This is presumably where the whole magnet motif came from. The Super Nerd's next Pokemon is Voltorb, whose Japanese name is Bididi Dama. This comes from the Japanese onomatopoeia bidi bidi, which can signify an electrical shock, as well as the word tama, which means ball. In this case, Voltorb is actually pretty close, but still not perfect in my opinion. Later on, we find ourselves battling a youngster, and when we win this battle, the youngster says losing is uncool in Japanese, but just losing stinks in English. Another rather odd change that was potentially made to not make kids feel as bad when they inevitably lose a battle. Moving on, the very next trainer we have to battle is a hiker. Hikers are called Yama Otoko in Japanese, which literally means mountain man. These two titles clearly give off different vibes. A hiker is someone who just hikes for fun, while a mountain man is typically someone who actually lives in the mountains. The level of commitment here is on a whole different level in the original Japanese. Sometime down the road, we run into our first member of Team Rocket, and he tells us that kids should go home in Japanese, but just to get lost in the localized English. The trainer type Rocket is known as Roketto Dain in Japanese. This literally means Team Rocket member. While I don't like that some information is lost here, I do think that Rocket sounds much cooler than Team Rocket member. This particular rocket has an Ekans, which is called abo in Japanese. This is the Japanese pronunciation of the word boa, elongated and reversed. A while later, we discover an HP up, and as you might expect, this is another localized name. HP ups are called Maxu Uppu, or Max Up in Japanese. This name clearly comes from the fact that this item raises your max HP. In the same room as the HP up, we find another Rocket, who explains to us in Japanese that Team Rocket are a strong and scary Pokemon mafia, while in English, he just says they're Pokemon gangsters. If you ask me, this is another example of attempting to make the game more child-friendly. As we saw in Part 1, this is a pretty common occurrence in Pokemon Red. The next Rocket we run into also underwent a similar change. He says that it's dangerous to stick your neck into the world of adults in Japanese, but simply to leave adults alone in the English localization. The former clearly implies a reaction of violence if you interrupt what they're doing, but the latter is more of a roundabout way of saying get lost. But anyway, we fight our way through a few more Rockets and finally find ourselves at the Super Nerd at the end of the cave. His first Pokemon out is Grimer, whose name in Japanese is Beto Beta. This comes from the two Japanese words beto beto and beta beta, which both mean sticky. There is also the possible connection to the English word tar, which would be pronounced in Japanese as taru. This Grimer knows the move Disable, which is another rather large localization change. The Japanese name for this move is Kanashibari. This word typically means sleep paralysis, but can also simply mean to be paralyzed or tied up. Either way, the localization to Disable is pretty far off. As for why this was changed, I'd assume it was because kids don't know what sleep paralysis is, and the other possible direct translations could be seen as too graphic for a younger audience. This Super Nerd also has a Coughing, whose Japanese name is Dogasu. This comes from the Japanese pronunciation for gas, or gasu, as well as dokugasu, which means poison gas. When we eventually defeat the final super nerd in Mount Moon, he allows us to take our pick of the 2 fossils he's found. Both of these fossils have slightly localized names in English. The dome fossil is known as the Kora no Kaseki, or shell fossil, and the helix fossil is known as the Kai no Kaseki, or shellfish fossil. The weird thing here is that both names could be translated as shell fossil, but neither was. The localizer went for a naming scheme that followed the artistic designs of the Pokemon that come out of these fossils, but the original game focused on what the Pokemon represent. After we choose our fossil, we finally make our way out of Mountain Moon, and the sign right outside tells us that we're on Route 4, which leads to Cerulean City, or Hanada City, as it's known in Japan. In this case, the 2 colors are actually very close in shade, but if I had to say, Cerulean does seem to be a slightly deeper blue than Hanada Ito. On our way to Cerulean City, we bump into a wild Spearow, which is known as Oni Suzume in Japanese. This name comes from the Japanese Oni, which is a type of demon, the Suzume, or sparrow, as well as the Beni Suzume, or red sparrow. When we get to town, we of course visit the Pokemon Center first, and here we find out from a young lad that Bill's Japanese name is Masaki. If you remember in part 1, I mentioned that most, if not all, major characters in the original Japanese Pokemon game are named after plants, and that rule applies here as well. Masaki are a type of small flowering tree that are native to Japan. They're known as Japanese spindles or evergreen spindles in English. When we talk to the trainer on the bench in the Pokemon Center, he tells us more about Bill, but he refers to him as Masaki Ni-chan in Japanese. This literally means Big Brother Masaki in English. This does not necessarily imply a familial relationship in Japanese, and I lean towards the side of not actually related in this case. The key thing here is that we now know this trainer is younger than Bill in Japanese, most likely much younger based on the way he talks. This is information we don't get in the localized English game. When we exit the Pokemon Center, we come across the sign that talks about this particular city, and in Japanese it explains what color Hanada is, while in English it says the city is wrapped in a mysterious blue aura. The funny thing about this sign is that the words used to describe the aura are very similar to those used to describe the color of the city in Japanese. I appreciate the callback, but you probably could have just changed Hanada to Cerulean here and been totally fine. Next we move on to the bike shop, and the kid inside tells us that the bikes in this shop are very expensive. However, in the original Japanese, he also says he can't afford one, but that line is missing from the English. Based on what I've seen so far in terms of localization, I'd assume this was changed to possibly prevent kids from getting sad at the fact that this kid can't afford a bike, but whatever the case may be, we once again have less information as an English player of Pokemon Red. The woman in the bottom right of the bike shop says she'll go with a mama chari, which means mama's bike. This is a Japanese slang term for a city cycle or city bike. She mentions that a shopping basket doesn't suit a mountain bike as well in Japanese, implying she wanted to buy one but decided not to because she thought she might look odd. In English, this interaction is changed to be that a city bike is good enough for her, and that she can't put a shopping basket on an MTB, or presumably mountain bike. The English here implies that she physically can't get a mountain bike because she needs to use it for shopping, but the Japanese leans more towards the side of how she'll be viewed by others for riding a mountain bike with a shopping basket. At first, this seems like a small change, but in reality, it basically changes the whole direction of the conversation. As for why this was changed, I actually have no idea. When we talk to the shop owner, he tells us that this store is called the Mirakuru Jitenshaya in Japanese, which means miracle bike shop in English. However, in the localized version of the game, this is changed to just be bike shop for some reason. The Japanese name gives the store such a different feel to it that I didn't even know existed until I played the Japanese version of the game. The whole place becomes sort of a joke in Japanese, and that gives it much more character in my opinion. Moving on, we start to make our way towards Nugget Bridge when we're approached by our rival. He gives us the classic speech about how cool he is and how much better he is than us, and during this conversation there is one minor localization change made. In the original Japanese, our rival describes the Pokemon he's caught as strong and awesome, but in the English localization this is changed to be strong and smart. This is of course yet another small change that doesn't really have any impact on the overall gameplay experience, but it is still a change made to a major character's dialogue, so I figured I'd mention it. During the battle with our rival, he sends out an Abra, and this is the first time we get to see one. In Japanese, Abra is known as Keishi. This comes from the 20th century American clairvoyant by the name of Edgar Cayce, who is said to have been able to make prophecies of sorts while asleep and exploring the dream realm. This is presumably where Abra gets its sleepy appearance. We make quick work of our rival, heal our Pokemon at the Pokemon Center, and start making our way across Nugget Bridge. This is a rather well-known localization, but in Japanese, Nugget Bridge is called Golden Ball Bridge, or Golden Ball Bridge. This is an innuendo that references the Japanese word for testicles, kintama, which is made up of the kanji for gold and ball. Not only is this a language-specific pun, it's also a rather raunchy joke that probably wouldn't fly with many parents, so it makes sense that it was changed. But other than the name of the bridge, the trainer dialogue here is pretty well translated. The only exception is the last trainer who tries to get you to join Team Rocket. At the end of his attempt to get you to join, he says he'll force you to join in Japanese, but this was replaced with "I'll make you an offer you can't refuse" in English. I've heard that the localizer for this game liked to add various pop culture references to his translations, and this is clearly an example of one that was forced in. But anyway, now that we're done with Golden Ball Bridge, we have to start moving east towards Bill's house. The first Pokemon trainer we run into on this route is a hiker, whose first Pokemon is a Machop, and we see that the Japanese name for Machop is Wandiki. This name comes from the Japanese word Wandyoku, which means arm strength. The Wan part obviously comes from the Wan in Wandyoku, meaning arm, and the Diki comes from another way to read the second character of Wandyoku, meaning power or strength, which is Diki. After we defeat the hiker, we fight our way through a few more trainers, and eventually arrive at a certain youngster, who gives us some useful information. He tells us about Vermilion City, which is known as Kuchiba City in Japanese. This is the first major discrepancy in the color chosen to represent a town. Kuchiba, or Kuchiba Iro, is a goldish-brown color that represents a dead leaf, while Vermilion is a bright red, almost orange color. Vermilion actually has a different name in Japanese, which is Shuiro. But as you can see, these two colors are very different. It's understandable that the name of the town was changed from dead leaf brown, but why was it changed to a color that's so different? Something like Umber Town or Sepia City would have been a closer representation of the Japanese name while still maintaining the cool name factor, in my opinion. This youngster also tells us about the SS Anne that's docked in Vermilion City, and in Japanese it's known as the Santo Annugo, or Saint Anne. If you're familiar with the Pokemon anime, they used the literal translation for that and it went over fine. Once again, just assuming here, but the name may have been changed to remove the slight religious reference in the Japanese name. At the end of the youngster's dialogue in Japanese, he says he went to the party aboard the SS Anne with his dad, and ends that thought with "Idaro." This means something akin to "isn't that nice" or "isn't that great?" However, in English, this slight brag is missing. The youngster's first Pokemon is a Slowpoke, which is Yadon in Japanese. This name comes from the Japanese word for hermit crab, which is Yadokari, as well as Donkan, which means dense, insensitive, or unresponsive. After the battle with the youngster, we run into a lass, who has definitely had some localization done to her dialogue. In English, she says, "Hi, my boyfriend is cool, but I'm a miniskirt and he's a Boy Scout" in Japanese. There is no concrete evidence to confirm that the two are dating. The word used for he here, namely kare, could mean boyfriend, but without context, it's impossible to know that that's what the intention was. When we actually reach the Boy Scout or junior trainer in question, we see he has very similar dialogue to the lass in Japanese. He says, "I'm a Boy Scout and she's a miniskirt." However, in English, this is changed to be, "I'm a cool guy. I've got a girlfriend." Once again, there is no irrefutable proof here that they are dating in the Japanese. The word for she used here could mean girlfriend, but it could also just mean she, which is the more common use. Without the proper context, we can't be sure what's going on here, so it's a little odd that the localizer just ran with the idea of these two being a couple. Not to mention the fact that they made the boy call himself a cool guy. That's just weird. The next trainer with some localization troubles is the youngster found slightly northeast of the previous group, and he says, "Mu, I have a feeling that you and I are going to battle" in Japanese, but I knew I had to fight you in English. The Japanese here is more of a premonition rather than an outright statement of fact. The nuance is just a tad off, not to mention that the "mu" exclamation was completely taken out. You might say it was removed. Get it? When this youngster loses, he says, "I knew I'd lose" in English, and "I had a feeling I'd lose" in Japanese. Same thing as the intro dialogue, the English is a concrete fact, while the Japanese is a feeling. And the last trainer on this route is a lass who, as you might have guessed, also had her fair share of localized dialogue. In Japanese, her pre-battle line is, "My friend has a lot of cute Pokemon. It's frustrating." While in English, she says, "My friend has a cute Pokemon. I'm so jealous." The obvious change here is that the friend has many cute Pokemon in Japanese, but we only know of one in the English version of the game. The other issue is with the ending of the sentence. In Japanese, it's implied that the lass is frustrated because she doesn't have as many cute Pokemon as her friend, while in English, she is simply jealous of her one cute Pokemon. This might seem like a small issue, but it completely changes the way this character could be seen by the player. This lass also had a slight difference in her lost text, which is "I'm not frustrated" in Japanese, and "I'm not so jealous" in English. The Japanese gives the feeling that she's frustrated about losing, but the English could be interpreted as her bringing up her friend's Pokemon again to mention that she's not really that jealous. The vectors here are in totally different directions, at least based on what I gathered from this conversation. Now that all the trainers are defeated, we can finally head into Bill's house, and his dialogue surprised me. But it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. In Japanese, Bill speaks in a dialect known as Kansai Ben. As the name implies, this is the dialect of the Kansai region of Japan. In the Pokemon world, the Kansai region is represented by the Johto region, which just so happens to be where Bill is originally from. Bill's official Japanese last name is also Sonezaki, which is a city in Osaka in the Kansai region that Bill's hometown of Goldenrod was based off of. But getting back on track here, there's a few slight localization changes in Bill's dialogue. One is that he says people call him the Pokemon Maniac in Japanese, but just states that he's a true blue Pokemaniac in English. The Japanese gives him a reputation for being well versed in Pokemon, while the English is just him praising himself. Another change is that the line where Bill implies that we don't believe that this Pokemon before us is the Pokemon Maniac in Japanese is completely missing in the English game. Bill also asks us to help him turn back into a human by using the self-separation system in English, but just the separation program in Japanese. This is a weird example of the English localization adding more detail to the dialogue when pretty much everywhere else it removes it. After Bill gets turned back into a human, he rewards us with an SS ticket for the SSN, and in Japanese this is known as the Fune Chiketto, or just boat ticket. Pretty strange that an extremely straightforward name like this was changed, but with that done, we can now head back to Cerulean to take on the gym. We find out from the guy up front that the leader's name is Misty in English and Kasumi in Japanese. The name Kasumi comes from Kasumi Soul, which is a type of flower in the carnation family commonly known as baby's breath. Kasumi also literally means mist in Japanese, and phonetically contains the word umi meaning ocean. The first trainer we face in Misty's gym is a swimmer. Swimmers are known as Kaipan Yaro in Japanese. This literally means swim trunks guy. Yaro is a slightly impolite way to refer to someone, similar to the kozo in Tampan kozo or youngster. This is also yet another example of a trainer being named after their pants in Japanese. Why Game Freak were obsessed with pants back in the day, I have no idea. The next trainer in the gym is a junior trainer girl, or Girl Scout as they're known in Japan. The Girl Scout has a Goldeen out first, and this is our first encounter with one. Goldeen are known as Tosakinto in Japanese, which comes from kintoto, a childish way to say goldfish in Japanese, and Tosakin, which is a type of goldfish that Goldeen greatly resembles. We take out the Goldeen with Pikachu, no problem, and it's on to Misty. Misty's intro dialogue is pretty well localized, but there are a few changes here and there. For one, the English line of, "Hi, you're a new face around here," was completely added out of nowhere. She says nothing of the sort in the Japanese. She also asks you what you're thinking about when you catch and raise a Pokemon, but that was localized to what is your approach when catching Pokemon. The thinking part got changed to an approach, and nowhere in the English is raising Pokemon mentioned. Misty's first Pokemon is Staryu, called Hitodemon in Japanese. Hitodemon comes from Hitode, meaning starfish, mon, or man, the famous Japanese superhero Ultraman, and the ship of one of Ultraman's enemies known as the Mimi Seijin, or Mimi aliens. Her second and final Pokemon, Starmie's name is unchanged from the Japanese, which is pretty neat. In her loss quote, Misty is clearly more troubled by her loss in Japanese, but in English, she appears happy to have lost to you and genuinely praises you. Another example of localization making the game more child-friendly, as well as just completely changing the personality of a character. The badge that Misty gives you is called the Blue Badge in Japanese and the Cascade Badge in English. Like I said with the Pewter Gym Badge, the Japanese name is very plain, so it definitely was a prime target for localization. Cascade Badge sounds much cooler. Misty also tells us that we can now use Cut outside of combat, and Cut definitely needed a name change because the original name was Iai Giri. Iai is a style of swordsmanship in Japan that involves drawing a sheathed sword and transitioning that into an attack. Iai Giri literally means Iai Cut. Misty tells us that we can use Cut to cut down bushes, but in the Japanese, she says we can use it to cut thin trees. I have no clue why this was changed. And with that, I think we've hit a good stopping point for this episode. If you made it all the way through, thank you so much. These videos take so much time to prepare, so it really does mean a lot to me. If you happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Part 3 should be out in a few weeks, but until then, thanks again for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out.